All right. So yeah, I'm excited to start this class. We're going to be covering 5 different types of writing. So we have personal writing, short stories, long prose, which is just like books, forms and techniques and poetry. So just sort of like a different kind of overview of poetry, and then a little fiction that we're going to do. And then just kind of depending on how y'all like the class, I do have a second semester, and we'll see if there is interest in that. So I think everybody that's here is already signed up for Google Classroom. And if you're not in the class right now and you're watching this video, you're definitely signed up for Google Classroom. There's going to be elements that we use for that. So we're going to be doing like peer review and stuff where you'll post a link to your Google Doc for a peer to review. So it asks you to do that in our first writing project. We're not going to do it for the first one. When I originally organized the class, I had intended it to be like a full semester, not just a quarter. So we had more time, but we will do it for Unit 2. So we'll actually talk about what that will look like when we get there. All right, so I think that's all my introductory stuff. So I guess not, because I just thought of another thing. Basically what we'll do in our live sessions is a couple of things. I will usually go over what the work is for the lesson activities with you. And I'll let you know if there are ones that you don't have to do. For example, there's one that you're not going to do today. And what else are we going to do? Yeah, mostly like just because there's a lot of activity that kind of goes into some of those lesson activities, we'll do that. And then I'll always review the writing project with you. And yeah, I guess it'll just depend on like what the subject is, but I'll usually share some examples as well. I pulled one up and I just remembered I didn't save it. Okay, so let's get started. So the other thing too is it's really important to check the pacing, because sometimes I might have you do the tutorials except for the lesson activities before class. The reason why is just so that I don't have to go over what's in the tutorial with you. That's what the tutorials do. So we're not going to necessarily go over like every single slide or anything, but I might refer back to them if the lesson activity warrants it. So we can do this a couple of different ways. You know, it just sort of depends on how comfortable everybody is. But I think for today, for the most part, I will lead the conversation. You can use the chat if you want to answer. There should also be a way for you to like raise your hand. I feel like there's a way to do that. I feel like I did it the other week. But yeah, just let me know if you have any input, if you have any questions. I will leave the chat open. You can also wave at me if you want to be on video. Yeah, so we're talking about creative writing. So today, in Unit 1, what we're really going to focus on is more of this like literary nonfiction idea. But we have creative fiction and then we have nonfiction. And so creative fiction is just what you're kind of used to when you read like novels or short stories, things that are made up. It's just made up. It's not real. It can be based in some elements of fact, but in general, like fiction is a false story. Nonfiction is not fiction. So a lot of times it's like textbooks or user manuals or newspaper articles. Also biographies, autobiographies, things like that. Those are considered nonfiction. And then when we talk about literary nonfiction, we can kind of go back to that idea of a biography or an autobiography. So biography is a book that somebody writes about somebody else. So like I could write a biography on George Washington. An autobiography you write about yourself. So I would write an autobiography about myself. No one would read it. It wouldn't be that interesting. But that's where literary nonfiction comes in, because what you're trying to do is make nonfiction more interesting. So like a biography, you wouldn't really want to read a book about somebody that was just like, here is a fact, here is a fact, here is a fact. That would be so boring. So that's why you have elements of literary nonfiction, which is mostly like style. So style is going to incorporate what sort of literary devices you use, the types of sentences you use, and really like anytime you're writing literary nonfiction, which would usually be sort of like some sort of essay about yourself, which hint is kind of writing project one, you want to use some stylistic elements. So you want to use, just literary devices, gosh, like similes, metaphors, but also like hyperbole and maybe some understatement, irony, things like that. So you're just trying to make it more interesting, but it's still true because it's still nonfiction. So that's really what it has in common with fiction. So that kind of goes over that first lesson activity. I'll jump down to 2. So this one is kind of interesting because the slide before it has these tips. So there are 6 tips, which is fun because it asks you to list 3 and 3. So 3 you already follow, and then 3 you intend to follow. So I can't pick those for you because I am not you, but I'm just going to talk about what the tips are so that you can think about that when you are writing. Okay, so the first tip, I'll go back to the slide. So the first tip is to write regularly. So no matter what it is that you're writing, just be creative regularly, do some sort of writing. And again, sorry, I feel like I didn't say it aloud. These are the tips for being a better writer. Knowing the basics of the language, so having a grip on your vocabulary and grammar. One of the best ways to become a better writer too is to read more, which is a big part of that. Like you get a better grasp on writing and vocabulary and grammar and how they're used in writing by reading more. So that's a helpful one. Use literary techniques. So you're telling a story, right? Like I was just talking about, don't be boring. Don't just like facts, facts, facts. You're trying to make somebody want to read what you're writing. So make it interesting. And then don't overdo it. Also, don't be pretentious. Avoid using cliches, archaic and difficult to use vocabulary, overusing similes, overusing repetition, things like that. Don't be like, I gotta cram all the literary devices into my story. Just make it flow. Try and think of it as if you were telling that story, how would you want people to be interested in it? And then try and not be distracted while you're writing. I know it can be super hard, especially when we're all hanging out at home. Both of my cats like to meow a lot, so sometimes I get distracted by trying to figure out why they're screaming at me. So just having some like undisturbed space or time is awesome. And then make sure that what you're writing is something you want to be writing. This is when you're being creative, not when you're doing schoolwork. Sometimes you don't want to write what you have to write about, but try and be sincere. Write things that matter to you because that's going to reflect in the writing. Okay, So those are the tips. So what you'll want to do is try and think, if you don't do 3 of them, you can point that out too and kind of explain why. You can go back through and there are some more tips, including reading more, that it talks about earlier on if I didn't cover them, and some of those were ones that you were interested in, but those are the ones I really want to talk about. And then for our last lesson activity, y'all are going to do this one totally alone because it's not anything that I can really do with you, but we can talk about it. So every writer needs some material to start the writing process. Although fiction writers write about imaginary events and people, many of the characters and situations are based on people they have met or know in their personal experiences. So there's 2 different options. You can write about 3 interesting people that you've met, and just like write a little paragraph on each one, why they're interesting, that kind of thing. Or you can reflect on personal experiences. It asks you to talk about at least 3. So it's just important to make sure that you're using details, and just be as like detailed and specific as possible. We're just going to try that as like an exercise, as always, be as detailed and specific as possible. If writing like as detailed and as specific as possible doesn't sound fun, creative writing is going to be hard. All right, so that's really going over the first tutorial. If you have any questions ever about the material that's in them, we can open that up as kind of like an option in the Google Classroom as like discussion. You can send me messages, stuff like that, and we can specifically go over some of that stuff. All right, so let's move on to the next tutorial. All right, so it tells you that we're gonna talk about this story essay. I don't remember what it is. Essay. But the link, at least when I was setting everything up, didn't work. So I pulled up another link. I will include it, I guess, somehow in the classroom. But you're also going to see it on my screen here in a minute. And then we're just going to look at the questions that we're getting asked first, so you can kind of think about them. I am going to read you the story, just so that you can think about these things while I'm reading it. I think it's a little bit easier sometimes to notice when you're hearing it, not just reading it yourself. All right. Sorry if I like lisp and I have to stop sometimes. I wear invisible aligners and I can only not wear them 2 hours a day. So I have to wear them. All right. I'm going to zoom in on this so that my eyes don't hurt. Hopefully you can see it pretty well. All right. So this is called Living Like Weasels by Annie Dillard. And then let's look at these questions. So we're going to be paying attention to what is effective about the craft of the essay. So you're going to think about how she crafted her essay for maximum effect. Like, what did she do in stylizing it and structuring it to make it effective and interesting? So what worked well? Why did it work well? And then what can you learn from the writing style? So those are the things that you're going to be focusing on while you are listening to this, so that you can answer your lesson activity. All right. I have to keep moving this little toolbar. Okay. A weasel is wild. Who knows what he thinks? He sleeps in his underground den, his tail draped over his nose. Sometimes he lives in his den for 2 days without leaving. Outside, he stalks rabbits, mice, muskrats, and birds, killing more bodies than he can eat warm, and often dragging the carcasses home. Obedient to instinct, he bites his prey at the neck, either splitting the jugular vein at the throat or crunching the brain at the base of the skull, and he does not let go. One naturalist refused to kill a weasel who was socketed into his hand deeply as a rattlesnake. The man could in no way pry the tiny weasel off There should be a comma there. And he had to walk half a mile to water, the weasel dangling from his palm, and soak him off like a stubborn label. And once, says Ernest Thompson Seton, once a man shot an eagle out of the sky. He examined the eagle and found the dry skull of a weasel fixed by the jaws to his throat. The supposition is that the eagle had pounced on the weasel, and the weasel swiveled and bit, as instinct taught him, to the neck, and nearly won. I would like to have seen that eagle from the air a few weeks or months before he was shot. Was the whole weasel still attached to his feathered throat, a fur pendant? Or did the eagle eat what he could reach, gutting the living weasel with his talons before his breast, bending his beak, cleaning the beautiful airborne bones? I have been reading about weasels because I saw one last week. I startled a weasel who startled me, and we exchanged a long glance. I don't know if you've ever startled an animal that startled you, but it's a fun experience. 20 minutes from my house, through the woods by the quarry and across the highway, in Holland's Pond, a remarkable piece of shallowness where I like to go at sunset and sit on a tree trunk. Holland's Pond is also called Murray's Pond. It covers 2 acres of bottomland near Tinker Creek with 6 inches of water and 6,000 lily pads. In winter, brown and white steers stand in the middle of it, merely dampening their hooves. From the distant shore, they look like a miracle itself, complete with miracle's nonchalance. Now, in summer, the steers are gone. The water lilies have blossomed and spread to a green horizontal plain that is terra firma to plodding blackbirds, and the tremulous ceiling to black leeches, crayfish, and carp. So that was a really heavy paragraph in terms of literary devices. So that's definitely something to think about, what she's doing there. This is, mind you, suburbia. It is a 5-minute walk in 3 directions to rows of houses, though none is visible here. There's a 55-mile-per-hour highway at one end of the pond, and a nesting pair of wood ducks at the other. Under every bush is a muskrat hole or a beer can. The far end is an alternating series of fields and woods, threaded everywhere with motorcycle tracks, in whose bare clay wild turtles lay eggs. So, I had crossed the highway, stepped over 2 low barbed wire fences, and traced the motorcycle path in all gratitude through the wild rose and poison ivy of the pond shoreline up into high grassy fields. Then I cut down through the woods to the mossy fallen tree where I sit. This tree is excellent. It makes a dry upholstered bench at the upper marshy end of the pond, a plush jetty raised from the thorny shore between a shallow blue body of water and deep blue body of sky. The sun had just set. I was relaxed on the tree trunk, ensconced in the lap of lichen, watching the lily pads at my feet tremble and part dreamily over the thrusting path of a carp. A yellow bird appeared to my right and flew behind me. It caught my eye. I swiveled around, and the next instant, inexplicably, I was looking down at a weasel, who was looking up at me. Weasel. I'd never seen one wild before. He was 10 inches long, thin as a curve, a muscled ribbon, brown as fruitwood, soft-furred, alert. His face was fierce, small, and pointed as a lizard's. He would have made a good arrowhead. There was just a dot of chin, maybe 2 brown hairs worth, and then the pure white fur that spread down his underside. He had 2 black eyes I didn't see, any more than you see a window. The weasel was stunned into stillness as he was emerging from beneath an enormous shaggy wild rose bush 4 feet away. I was stunned into stillness, twisted backward on the tree trunk, our eyes locked, and someone threw away the key. Our look was as if 2 lovers or deadly enemies met unexpectedly on an overgrown path when each had been thinking of something else, a clearing blow to the gut. It was also a bright blow to the brain, or sudden beating of brains, with all the charge and intimate grate of rubbed balloons. It emptied our lungs. It felled the forest, moved the fields, and drained the pond. The world dismantled and tumbled into the black hole of eyes. If you and I looked at each other that way, our skulls would split and drop to our shoulders. But we don't. We keep our skulls. So, he disappeared. This was only last week, and I already don't remember what shattered the enchantment. I think I blinked. I think I retrieved my brain from the weasels and tried to memorize what I was seeing, and the weasel felt the yank of separation, the careening splash down into real life, and the urgent current of instinct. He vanished under the wild rose. I waited motionless, my mind suddenly full of data and my spirit with pleadings, but he didn't return. Please do not tell me about approach avoidance conflicts. I tell you I've been in the weasel's brain for 60 seconds and he was in mine. Brains are private places, muttering through unique and secret tapes. But the weasel and I both plugged into another tape simultaneously for a sweet and shocking time. Can I help it if it was a blank? What goes on in his brain the rest of the time? What does a weasel think about? He won't say. His journal is tracks in clay, a spray of feathers, mouse blood and bone, uncollected, unconnected, loose leaf, and blown. I would like to learn or remember how to live. I come to Holland's Pond not so much to learn how to live as, frankly, to forget about it. That is, I don't think I can learn from a wild animal how to live in particular. Shall I suck warm blood, hold my tail high, walk with my footprints precisely over the prints of my hands? But I might learn something of mindlessness, something of the purity of living in the physical sense and the dignity of living without bias or motive. The weasel lives in necessity, and we live in choice, hating necessity and dying at the last ignobly in its talons. I would like to live as I should, as the weasel lives as he should. And I suspect that for me, the way is like the weasel's, open to time and death painlessly, noticing everything, remembering nothing, choosing to give in with a fierce and pointed will. I missed my chance. I should have gone for the throat. I should have lunged for that streak of white under the weasel's chin and held on through mud and into the wild rose, held on for dearer life. We could live under the wild rose as weasels, mute and uncomprehending. I could very calmly go wild. I would live 2 days in the den, curled, leaning on mouse fur, sniffing bird bones, blinking, licking, breathing musk, my hair tangled in the roots of grasses. Down is a good place to go, where the mind is single. Down is out of your ever-loving mind and back to your careless senses. I remembered muteness as a prolonged and giddy fast, where every moment is a feast of utterance received. Time and events are merely poured, unremarked, and ingested directly, like blood pulsed into my gut through a jugular vein. Could two live that way? Could two live under the wild rose and explore by the pond, so that the smooth mind of each is as everywhere present to the other, and as received and as unchallenged as falling snow? We could, you know. We can live any way we want. People take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, even of silence by choice. The thing is to stalk your calling in a certain skilled and supple way, to locate the most tender and live spot and plug into that pulse. This is yielding, not fighting. A weasel doesn't attack anything. A weasel lives as he's meant to, yielding at every moment to the perfect freedom of single necessity. I think it would be well and proper and obedient and pure to grasp your one necessity and not let it go, to dangle it limp from wherever it takes you. Then, even death, where you're going no matter how you live, cannot you part. Seize it and let it seize you up aloft even, till your eyes burn out and drop. Let your musky flesh fall off in shreds and let your very bones unhinge and scatter, loosened over fields and woods, lightly, thoughtless, from any height at all, from high as eagles. All right, so there's definitely a lot of literary devices that she used, what we call sensory detail, so things that relate to your five senses. There's a lot of visuals, so sight, think about touching, hearing, smelling, tasting, your senses. So she used a lot of that. She used some literary techniques too. Her grammar and punctuation was part of the style. So there's definitely a lot to talk about there. Get my lesson up. All right. And then The next lesson activity, you only have to do one entry for this. That's really all I have to say. It says keep a diary for a week. You can write one on whatever day you want to write it about. But I do want you to keep that focus narrow. So one event on one day or an hour in one day. But I want you to write as much detail about that event as possible. So try and pick something like interesting of some sort, just so that you have enough to write about. It can be relatively recent. It doesn't have to be like right away. And then I forgot to open this link in here. So that's going to be annoying. Okay. So the very last lesson activity for this unit, you do not have to do the work. That's not necessarily true. I don't want you to write this full paragraph essay. What I want you to do, we're going to watch a speech, and then I just want you to write like some bullet points about like what makes this interesting. We don't need to write the whole essay. We don't really have time for that, especially not that long of one. And then you don't have to do part B at all. So in part A, we're going to watch a speech. You're going to listen along, and then, just make some points about what is effective. So at least 3 examples. I think you can probably find a few more. So give me 1 second while I pull that up. I'm hoping I can find this a little bit easier. Yeah, found it. All right. So this is a TED Talk given by Elizabeth Gilbert. She's the author of Eat, Pray, Love, which is like a big thing that people were really into, like, I don't know, 8 years ago. Anyway, this just kind of went along with what I was trying to get with our writing project, and so we're gonna go ahead and do this.
So a few years ago, I was at JFK Airport, about to get on a flight, when I was approached by 2 women who I do not think would be insulted to hear themselves described as tiny, old, tough-talking Italian-American broads. The taller one, it's like up here, she comes marching up to me, and she goes, "Honey, I gotta ask you something. You got something to do with that whole eat, pray, love thing that's been going on lately?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And she smacks her friend and she goes, "See, I told you, I said, that's that girl. That's that girl who wrote that book based on that movie." So that's who I am. And believe me, I'm extremely grateful to be that person, because that whole eat, pray, love thing was a huge break for me. But it also left me in a really tricky position moving forward as an author, trying to figure out how in the world I was ever going to write a book again that would ever please anybody. Because I knew well in advance that all of those people who had adored Eat, Pray, Love were going to be incredibly disappointed in whatever I wrote next, because it wasn't going to be Eat, Pray, Love. And all of those people who had hated Eat, Pray, Love were going to be incredibly disappointed in whatever I wrote next, because it would provide evidence that I still lived. So I knew that I had no way to win, and knowing that I had no way to win made me seriously consider for a while just quitting the game and moving to the country to raise corgis. But if I had done that, if I had given up writing, I would have lost my beloved vocation. So I knew that the task was that I had to find some way to gin up the inspiration to write the next book, regardless of its inevitable negative outcome. In other words, I had to find a way to make sure that my creativity survived its own success. And I did in the end find that inspiration, but I found it in the most unlikely and unexpected place. I found it in lessons that I had learned earlier in life about how creativity can survive its own failure. So just to back up and explain, the only thing I have ever wanted to be for my whole life was a writer. I wrote all through childhood, all through adolescence. By the time I was a teenager, I was sending my very bad stories to the New Yorker, hoping to be discovered. After college, I got a job as a diner waitress, kept working, kept writing, kept trying really hard to get published, and failing at it. I failed at getting published for almost 6 years. So for almost 6 years, every single day, I had nothing but rejection letters waiting for me in my mailbox. And it was devastating every single time. And every single time I had to ask myself, if I should just quit while I was behind and give up and spare myself this pain. But then I would find my resolve, and always in the same way, by saying, I'm not going to quit, I'm going home. You have to understand that for me, going home did not mean returning to my family's farm. For me, going home meant returning to the work of writing, because writing was my home. Because I loved writing more than I hated failing at writing, which is to say that I loved writing more than I loved my own ego, which is ultimately to say that I loved writing more than I loved myself. And that's how I pushed through it. But the weird thing is that 20 years later, during the crazy ride of Eat, Pray, Love, I found myself identifying all over again with that unpublished young diner waitress who I used to be, thinking about her constantly and feeling like I was her again, which made no rational sense whatsoever, because our lives could not have been more different. She had failed constantly. I had succeeded beyond my wildest expectation. We had nothing in common. Why did I suddenly feel like I was her all over again? And it was only when I was trying to unthread that I finally began to comprehend the strange and unlikely psychological connection in our lives between the way we experience great failure and the way we experience great success. So think of it like this. For most of your life, you live out your existence here in the middle of the chain of human experience where everything is normal and reassuring and regular. But failure catapults you abruptly way out over here into the blinding darkness of disappointment. Success catapults you just as abruptly, but just as far, way out over here into the equally blinding glare of fame and recognition and praise. One of these states is objectively seen by the world as bad. The other one is objectively seen by the world as good. But your subconscious is completely incapable of discerning the difference between bad and good. The only thing that it is capable of feeling is the absolute value of this emotional equation, the exact distance that you have been flung from yourself. And there's a real equal danger in both cases of getting lost out there in the hinterlands of the psyche. But in both cases, it turns out that there is also the same remedy for self-restoration, and that is that you have got to find your way back home again as swiftly and smoothly as you can. And if you're wondering what your home is, here's a hint. Your home is whatever in this world you love more than you love yourself. So that might be creativity, it might be family, might be invention, adventure, faith, service, might be raising corgis. I don't know. Your home is that thing to which you can dedicate your energies with such singular devotion that the ultimate results become inconsequential. For me, that home has always been writing. So after the weird, disorienting success that I went through with Eat, Pray, Love, I realized that all I had to do was exactly the same thing that I used to have to do all the time when I was an equally disoriented failure. I had to get my ass back to work. And that's what I did. And that's how in 2010, I was able to publish the dreaded follow-up to Eat, Pray, Love. And you know what happened with that book? It bombed. And I was fine. Actually, I kind of felt bulletproof because I knew that I had broken the spell and I had found my way back home to writing for the sheer devotion of it. And I stayed in my home of writing after that. And I wrote another book that just came out last year. And that one was really beautifully received, which is very nice, but not my point. My point is that I'm writing another one now. And I'll write another book after that, and another, and another, and another. And many of them will fail. And some of them might succeed. But I will always be safe from the random hurricanes of outcome, as long as I never forget where I rightfully live. Look, I don't know where you rightfully live, but I know that there's something in this world that you love more than you love yourself. Something worthy, by the way. So addiction and infatuation don't count, because we all know that those are not safe places to live, right? The only trick is that you've got to identify the best, worthiest thing that you love most, and then build your house right on top of it and don't budge from it. And if you should someday, somehow get vaulted out of your home by either great failure or great success, then your job is to fight your way back to that home the only way that it has ever been done, by putting your head down and performing with diligence and devotion and respect and reverence whatever the task is that love is calling forth from you next. You just do that, and keep doing that again and again and again. And I can absolutely promise you from long personal experience in every direction, I can assure you that it's all going to be okay. Thank you.
All right. So I thought that was interesting. So yeah, just think about some of the things that she did in her speech to keep you interested in it. It can be super easy sometimes to sort of like space off. So what kept you interested in the speech? So those are really what I want you to think about just when you're making some points. So again, just some points for part A on this speeches lesson activity, and don't do part B. All right. So last part of class today is just going to be going over the writing project. So all of our writing projects are going to give you a copy to open your own Google Doc version. There are a couple of changes I sort of want you to consider for this one. Like I said, we're not going to do the peer review. So we're going to talk about those as we go through the essays. So you can either keep note of it, alter them on your version if you want to pull that up, or just come back to the video and make note of it later on. So I'm going to make my own copy. Even though I have multiple copies already. All right. So what you're going to do for your first writing project is to write a personal essay about failure. So I put this quote from Michael Jordan: "I can accept failure. Everyone fails at something, but I can't accept not trying." Sorry, this might be a little small. I'm using them. There we go. Okay. So failure essays can be some of the best kinds to write, as they are both a way to process an event and reflect on it, and a way to learn how to cultivate an honest tone in your writing. Everybody fails, and it's important to reflect on failure and learn from it. Failure can be embarrassing, painful, mentally, emotionally, physically, you name it, and perhaps this is where the saying, "no pain, no gain," comes from. All right, so the first thing is you don't necessarily have to write a full 3-page essay. It should absolutely not be any less than 4 paragraphs of writing. I mean, like, I want about 800 words. Like, this is a writing class. But like I said, originally, this was going to be like elongated as a class. And now we've condensed it. So you might get a little bit like smaller word requirements, but it's a writing class. So yeah, so aim for about 800 words. It should be like no less than 4 paragraphs, just in the way that it's written. You're not doing like 5-paragraph essay format. You're writing a personal essay. So it's like you're telling a story about a time that you failed, but you learned something from it. So the way I want you to do it is always a first draft, and then you'll get some sort of review, which in this case is going to come from me, and then you'll get your final draft. So try to write your essay in half-hour time chunks until you have a finished skeleton of your essay. It should feel complete, like you should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but it might need details and literary devices and things like that. But this is your draft. And then once you've finished this draft, you are going to go up here and click the share button. And you're going to enter my email address, which is jackiewilding@oflschools.org, and you're going to send it to me. And then I am going to make notes on it. There is a feature called like edits, or like I can turn on a thing. I'll figure it out later. I can't remember how to do it. And I'll make notes, and then you'll be able to see those, and you'll be able to accept the edits. I might make a video and post that to the Google Classroom. Anyway, so you're going to do that. I've included this link too. When I was looking for like examples, I actually found that this was a little bit more interesting than an example, because it gave you a really specific way to think about it. And I don't remember if like I got the idea about a failure essay thinking about college essays or whatever, but this is just a type of essay I've always really enjoyed, because kind of what this outlines. So kind of skip down to kind of this part here. Okay, so failures almost always involve a form of miscommunication, and another way to talk about failure is to point to the failure that underlies the failure. And this, again, is almost always a form of miscommunication. Providing this information can be just as valuable as explaining the details of the specific failure itself, such as the quantitative facts related to the failure, for example. So we're not going to talk about that little part there. Okay. So it kind of gives you like an outline of how to think about writing the essay. Using journalist tools, who, what, where, when, why. Talk about the failure that was behind the failure. Again, lack of communication. Talk about the sense of disorientation. So yeah, just make sure that you're really outlining like why. Again, this link is included in the activity. It's helpful to kind of read over this if you're struggling to sort of think about how to like push this into an essay. So, okay. And then, so yeah, once you're done with the draft, you're going to share it with me. You can actually go ahead and delete all of task 2 here if you want on yours, because I'm going to do all of that for you, again, for the sake of time. And then after I've given you comments and just sort of like letting you know what I think you should add or take out or anything, then you write your final draft and then you will submit it to the Dropbox. So you'll just come back, submit it like you would submit any other activity, and then you'll be done with your first unit. So yeah, that pretty much covers it. If you're trying to think of things, you know, definitely look up examples. I do run everything through a plagiarism checker, so please don't try to use somebody else's work, especially because, again, this is a writing class and it's voluntary, it's an elective. So I hope that you're here because you want to write and you want to learn about writing and you want to learn how to be a better creative writer. Yeah, that is all that I have for class today. So thank you very much for attending or watching the video, depending on how you're doing this. Please let me know if you have any questions. You can email me or text me. If you email me or if you have an email from me, you have my phone number. But yeah, thank you so much. And I look forward to this journey of creative writing with you. Bye.